Hi, Sophie.
Hi, Sin.
Hi, everyone. And welcome to What, Where, Why of Armored Core 6, Episode 1, Allmind! Woo!
Yay!
What is Allmind?
So we've talked a little bit about, the previous Armored Core games on this channel.
Mm-hmm.
Much of this discussion occurred prior to the announcement of Armored Core 6. That's just me heading off the comments that are accusing us of jumping on a bandwagon. Which, weirdly, we still get. Even though there's, literally me streaming Armored Core 1, 5 years ago, talking about how, this is actually my copy from 1998. So in the earlier Armored Core games, there's a tendency in the plot for them to introduce, some sort of AI or system or something like that is overseeing the world. And the traditional way that plays out is, your character thinks that they are completely independent, they are completely self-willed, they're making their own decisions, they're creating their own destiny, and then at a certain point, it's oh, you went too far. And now the system that is governing the world, whether that is a group of people or whether it is an AI, starts to go, oh, okay, you're actually starting to upset the balance. So I've been maintaining this world in sort of stasis in the best way I can. I'm the thing that's been orchestrating all these corporations and mercenaries to fight each other, basically as a way of maintaining that stasis. You've now come along and you've done kind of too well. And you've broken out of the little paradigm I've created, so now I am going to turn this system against you. So, Allmind is kind of that, but also kind of the opposite. In that, in the previous Armored Core games, that system is already in place when you start. And you discover how the system operates throughout the game. In Fires of Rubicon, you're actually witnessing Allmind start to integrate itself. It doesn't actually have a great deal of control when you first encounter it.
Mm-hmm.
And the plot of Fires of Rubicon is, or at least the New Game Plus Plus pathway that leads to the Coral release ending, is Allmind putting the pieces in place so that they can become that governing system.
Mm-hmm. And I was thinking of Allmind in more of simple basic terms. What is that?
Allmind is for all mercenaries.
Yeah, Allmind is for all mercenaries.
But specifically 4 of them, and then specifically 1 of them. Hi, Sophie here, hoping you're enjoying another great episode of What, Where, Why. What, Where, Why is a series that Sin and I usually do on Patreon, but sometimes if the topic is especially important, we make it available for freeloaders. If you enjoyed Sin and I taking roughly an hour to answer 3 fairly basic questions, why not head over to patreon.com/SinclairLaw for even more of this? And now, back to the podcast.
She's for all mercenaries, and she's a weapon manufacturer. She's a weapon and parts shop. She's a LinkedIn. She's a PSVR, and she's a catfish.
And a VTuber.
And a VTuber.
Yeah.
What I wonder is, there's Allmind, right? And then there's the AI that we, later meet that calls herself Kate.
Yeah.
So Allmind, is that the name of the entire organization that is providing all those services, whereas Kate is just a small part of it that's an AI?
So, for people who maybe don't know or need a refresher or something, because the game's actually been out for quite a while, in the New Game Plus Plus story path, where you end up kind of doing Allmind's dirty work for her, you sometimes get paired with a pilot called Kate Markson.
Raven, thanks for the help with the mission. We'll meet again.
And Kate Markson has the same voice actor as Allmind, just without the sort of computery processing applied, so she sounds a bit less like GLaDOS.
Without autotune.
Yeah. And what will happen is when you encounter her, Walter and Carla will be like, who the hell is this? She's not showing up in any records, and they'll do a little bit of snooping, and gradually it will come to the fore that there is no Kate Markson. Like, she doesn't exist. And they never actually come out and say Kate Markson is Allmind. Like, no one, there's not like a moment where Walter suddenly realizes, oh my god, it's Allmind. But it very clearly is Allmind. It's Allmind doing a very bad impersonation of a human.
Hello, human.
Yeah.
Please assist me in this mission.
I am completely normal human Kate Markson. What is an Allmind? So the thing about Kate Markson is, like, because you do missions with Kate Markson can actually be destroyed mid-mission.
Yeah.
And if that happens, like, Allmind just keeps going.
Yeah.
So either Kate Markson is, like, a separate AI that Allmind creates and downloads into a mech, which is kind of part of Allmind's plan, which we'll get to later on.
Mm-hmm.
Or Allmind is just remote controlling the mech entirely.
Mm-hmm. That's a good explanation, but my question, I think, is more like, you know how you have the Arquebus Corporation?
Yep.
So, like, Allmind, is there... I guess that's going into where, but is there a corporation and they're like, hey, this is our Allmind branch, and we have an Allmind system on, like, each planet so that the mercenaries can access it, and it's... You know what I mean?
Okay, so Allmind is connected to a thing called Nest. This is how they kind of link it back to the other Armored Core games.
Mm-hmm.
Because prior to the introduction of Nest, like, yes, it's Armored Core, but it doesn't seem to have any connection to the previous games.
Okay.
It's just like a separate story that's happening. It could be a completely different universe. It could be so far in the future it no longer matters. It's using the terminology, but it's not, like, connected to the previous stories in any way. And what ends up happening is when you activate Nest, which is the thing the game is using for its online PvP system, it's the online arena fights. Nest is something from the earlier games.
Okay.
Like, every game sort of has its own, like, they're not really hub worlds, but they'll have, like, a sort of central base you operate from, usually just a menu on a screen. And that is initially called Raven Nest. And when you look at, like, the way they describe Nest in the game, it's like, this is a system that mercenaries used to use in the past.
Yeah, that completely flew over my head. As you know, I'm not a PvP fan.
Yeah, I'm
so
not
I
either. Like, I've never done PvP in this game.
So that's cool.
But,
Thank you, Sophie.
So you get the impression from, like, Allmind's connection to that, like, Allmind is maybe, like, a leftover AI from an earlier generation.
Mm-hmm.
That, like, we mentioned Allmind doesn't actually have, like, a great deal of control at the start. And it's almost like Allmind's been sitting there absorbing all of the combat data from all these pilots over however many, years, possibly centuries, whatever. Absorbing all of this combat data, and it's gradually starting to formulate a plan about how it's going to run things.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sophie. So yeah, like you mentioned, one of the things that Allmind does is she collects all this information on all the different people and mechs that we encounter, and we can get them as rewards in her, like, PSVR arena.
Yeah.
So for what purpose is she gathering all this information?
So the arena's broken into kind of two chunks. It feeds it to you throughout the game. So, like, the first kind of, I'd say, 2/3 of the arena is just, like, fights with pilots. It'll just give you, like, a bio of the pilot, usually fills in a little something about their backstory that's kind of relevant to the rest of the world, but it's primarily about the pilot. And then when you get into the last kind of third of the fights, you're not necessarily fighting, like, other, like, members of, like, Arquebus or the Red Guns or something like that. You're fighting things Allmind is creating.
Mm-hmm.
And they have little sort of bios that hint at, like, the progression that Allmind is going through to create these things. So one of the things about Allmind is, like, she has control over mechs that are not manufactured by her. So she has control over mechs from the Rubicon Research Institute.
Yeah.
So the weird, like, I think they're called helianthus. These the ones that roll into like a ball. They're like the bone wheel skeletons from Dark Souls.
Yeah.
She has control over those. She has control over some of the PCA like cloaked ones, the ones that are invisible.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But not all of them. She's just hacked them and taken control over them.
Yeah.
So it's initially not 100% clear that like that's Allmind until you go back and look at what she's doing and what they're actually accomplishing. And one of the instances of that is if you go to the mission that is set in Grid 135, which is where you first begin the game, like when you drop out of orbit and you land there. If you go back to where you initially impacted, there's an Allmind controlled PCA thing that's like scanning the area. So it's like Allmind. We'll get into this later, but because of who you are, Allmind has been tracking you since you entered Rubicon.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you go through what Allmind is doing in the arena, right?
Yeah.
You start piecing together this like chain of sort of events as Allmind is doing research. So it's like Allmind starts by kind of raiding like the data from the Rubicon Research Institute to make these like bootleg Rubicon Research Institute mechs. That's where the mind stuff comes from. If you look at like it's like Mind Alpha, Mind Beta, Mind Gamma, like that stuff, it sort of looks like Ibis and sort of looks like the mech that's designed from Walter. Because she's kind of bootlegging that technology. Yeah. And the reason that she is looking at all this mercenary data from the arena is that she becomes obsessed with the idea that at a certain level, mercenaries start to view the AC as an extension of their body. So it stops being about like a pilot in a mech and it becomes like actually the pilot's mind is in the mech's body. And she's interested in like the blurring of that boundary between like where does the mind end and the body begin, because that's kind of what she's interested in as like the next step forward for humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And also it makes sense from her perspective because she's literally an AI.
Yeah.
So she becomes interested in the various factions for different reasons because she thinks she can kind of synthesize what they're all doing. So she wants the Rubicon Research Institute mechs because they're the mechs that can interface with Coral.
Mm-hmm.
The other ones aren't really doing that. She wants the Rubicon Liberation Front mechs because those are the mechs that like the pilots closely view as an extension of their own body. And she wants the Arquebus and Balaam mechs because those are the ones that they kind of have the opposite philosophy where they view like humans as in constant conflict with the environment. So they want to create something that like seals humans off and destroys everything around them. So she becomes interested in like, how do I synthesize something out of these to create like the sort of perfect fusion of like a human mind and not even a human mind, like a disembodied mind and like a mechanical body. She's specifically interested in the Rubicon Research Institute data because that's the data that deals with humans entering into a symbiotic relationship with Coral, which is kind of what she's aiming to accomplish in the Coral release ending.
Mm-hmm.
And her goal, explicitly stated, is to create a future where pilots and ACs operate completely in symbiosis, so there's not actually like a line anymore between the pilot and the AC. And you can see that eventually evolves into her like, well, what if everything was just a disembodied consciousness? What if we would just process through the Coral and then that was controlling the ACs? And then that is all directed from the top by Allmind.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of what I was saying at the start, where it's like she's putting in place this system where everything will be controlled from the top down by an AI, which is kind of how the other Armored Core games start, whereas this is how the game ends.
Mm-hmm. So essentially she wants to rule the universe.
I don't know if she wants to rule the universe in like a megalomaniacal way, but she just sort of comes across as like thinking like, well, I'll just bring order to everything. Like she sees like all the conflict and everything will sort of end and I'll just be this organizing principle that goes down. The plan to accomplish that is what she's putting in place throughout that New Game Plus Plus story arc, so we'll get to that as we cover it.
Okay. I think we have a pretty good idea on what Allmind is
Yeah,
so far.
yeah.
So now we have to understand, where is Allmind?
That's a really good question because she just seems to be everywhere. I think the thing about an AI is like it can just replicate itself or it can just like hop from computer to computer. Like you get the impression All Mind isn't like there's not like a central sort of All Mind core that is directing everything. It's just like a decentralized network that is functioning together. And I think that's very deliberately like similar to Coral.
Yeah.
Because I think they very much want you to like draw a comparison between the way that the Allmind AI network's working and the way that like the coral itself is this like colony of sentient things that like individually don't necessarily do very much, but if you get a whole lot of them together, they form this massive, powerful network.
Hmm.
Hmm.
I kind of imagined it a bit like when we go into our AC, right? You know how
Yeah,
when you're in a power armor or Fallout, you have like little things
all
appear
the
on
time.
screen
Yeah.
all the time. So I don't know. I kind of imagine it the same way, where we have little things on screen and she's kind of talking into our ear and like,
Yeah, it's like when we achieve that relationship with air.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, except I think you can turn All Mind off. Air is just sort of like stuck in you forever.
yeah, yeah. Huh.
Yeah.
My God, you can't turn air off.
No.
It's true. Sophie, does Allmaid have any employees?
Yes, actually, she has I think four distinct employees, and then just a whole lot of little mechs she's taken over. So
Mm-hmm.
Allmind's plan involves what she calls the three factors,
Mm-hmm.
and it's written in a very like mech anime way where like no one will just be straight about what the factors are. It's just designed to sound creepy. As the third factor is now ignored. It's like she has no reason to write that. Um,
Yeah.
but anyway, the three factors are right. So she calls them the primary factor, the secondary factor, and the third factor. She needs all these factors working together to achieve her objective. So
Mm-hmm.
the primary factor is just all the coral going into the vascular plant.
Mm-hmm.
So she basically says, like, the primary factor is something that's going to be put in place by arquebuss without arquebuss realizing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because arquebuss are the ones that repair the vascular plant.
Mm-hmm.
So from that point onward, it's like she kind of stays out of the corporation's way in a sense for a while because she just wants them to gather as much coral as they can. Because the she's not interested in what she calls orphaned coral because coral needs to be like at a certain density to be useful. So that's why, for instance, she doesn't care about you blowing up the coral transports because that coral's been taken out of the main like hunk of coral. So once you've extracted that coral and put it in those little like coral tanks and sent it off in a helicopter, it's not really useful anymore because it's been removed from the main coral colony, so you can just get rid of that. It's also presumably why she wants the Rubicon Liberation Front fucked up, because they're the ones who are like liberating the coral.
Yeah.
Like they don't want the coral mined in the same way. They're just
Mm-hmm.
taking little doses of it. So basically, she sits there and she waits for arquebuss to repair the vascular plant and for the vascular plant to fill with coral. So that's the primary factor. The secondary factor is what she calls a C-pulse wave mutation, and that's what air is. So she doesn't know that there is a specific C-pulse wave mutation called air. She doesn't know when this is going to happen, but she's basically just waiting for there to be an incident that
Mm-hmm.
leads to the spontaneous creation or whatever. We'll talk about coral another time because coral's really
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah.
Like some sort of consciousness emerging from the coral. That has to have happened. That's what's happening in the Attack the Watchpoint mission with Balteus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what happens is when you go to that mission, on the first playthrough, there's another mercenary called Sulla who's waiting for you. So Sulla is the initial third factor. So at that point, Allmind is aware that there is a wave mutation in that watch point.
Mm-hmm.
So she kind of knows air exists before we meet air, before anyone really meets air. And she
Mm-hmm.
specifically sends Sulla to the watch point because at that point in her plan, Sulla is the third factor.
Okay.
So there's kind of a meme in the community that Allmind is an idiot.
Really?
Yeah, because
Aw.
her plan doesn't quite work out the way she's expecting.
Okay.
But not to defend like the megalomaniacal AI, right? But
Yeah.
the thing about Allmind is like she's not actually really in a position to do very much at the start of the game. So the reason Allmind's plan is failing is because she's just having to improvise. Like she knows what she needs to do, but like she can't control what everyone else is doing. Like she can't
Right.
control where Walter is going. She can't actually control 621. She can't like control the people she wants to be the third factor. That's just down to them. So she's just sort of like having to constantly improvise and come up with like, okay, that didn't work. I'll have to try this. And I don't think that makes her stupid. It just means like she doesn't actually have total control over any of this. So what the third factor is broadly is just an augmented human whose augmentation is from one of the first 4 generations, because those generations are augmented in a way that lets them interface with Coral. So there's 4 of them. There is Sulla. Sulla is, when we go to that mission, Allmind's current pick for the third factor is Sulla. That doesn't work out because we kill Sulla, but we're also of that augmentation generation. So when we encounter her, it's like, well, okay, it's worked out anyway.
Yeah.
The other 2 are Iguazu.
Is Iguazu? I don't think so.
No,
Iguazu
is an older generation augmentation. That's why he fuses with her consciousness at the end. And that's why when you're fighting Iguazu with Iguazu will start yelling about like there's a voice in my head, he's talking about air.
But why didn't she just pick Iguazu then? Why did she still need us?
Because Iguazu doesn't make contact with the sea pulse.
You're right.
We're the ones who get air. So at that point, Iguazu's sort of not that useful to her, but he's still kind of on the list.
Okay.
And that's why, like, when you're fighting Iguazu, he'll start yelling at, like, there's a voice in my head, what's that voice? That's air, because he's picking up on air being there. But she's not actually in his head properly, so he's just experiencing these, like, weird sort of, like, nausea episodes from her being there.
Okay.
Yeah. So it doesn't work out with Iguazu. The other one it doesn't work out with is O'Keefe from the Vespers. So O'Keefe actually starts out as a second-gen augmentation. And you're actually sent to kill O'Keefe later on. And when you actually meet him in-game, even though he starts off as a second generation, he becomes 9th generation. So that second augmentation taking him from second generation to 9th generation is actually like that shuts off his link to the Coral. So Allmind can no longer use him. And you might think, is that just a coincidence? Like, is that just he got an augmentation, he's not useful anymore? But when you encounter him in the mission where Allmind sends you to assassinate him, he's straight up telling you, like, no, don't follow Allmind. Allmind's not worth it. I've looked into what Coral Release will accomplish and I don't want to be part of it. So presumably, like, that jump from 2nd to 9th, it's actually quite a significant jump. I think that's literally supposed to be him going, like, I can't be part of this, and he's just cutting off the link to the Coral completely, so he's no longer able to be part of it. But yeah, O'Keefe knows. Like, he knows what Allmind's plan is, he's thought about it, and he's aware of the implications. And that's why he turns against her. Whereas, like, Iguazu, he's along for the ride because he's just so angry. And he's just so obsessed with, like, getting revenge on people who've wronged him that, like, that sort of blinds him. And that actually ends up becoming, weirdly part of, like, the final boss fight, but it's in a line that's deleted, but I guess we'll talk about it later. Basically, to summarize, like, Allmind wants to do Coral Release. So to do the Coral Release, she needs all the coral in the vascular plant at a certain density, which happens because that's what the corporations are siphoning in there. She needs a sea pulse wave mutation, which happens kind of spontaneously at the Attack the Watchpoint mission.
Mhm.
And then she needs a human with Gen 4 augmentation or earlier to interface with a C-pulse wave mutation, which is us. So we become Allmind's pawn. If we had, like, and I guess this does happen, like, because there's different endings to the game, but, like, say we screw up or we die or we don't do what Allmind wants us to, she's powerless because she doesn't have that. So it would have to presumably, like, you just wait. So, like, maybe, like, 200 years later, some more people come to Rubicon and she finds some other way of doing it.
Uh-huh.
But that's why Allmind wants us. It's not necessarily that, like, we're the bestest, coolest mercenary on Rubicon. It's that we literally have, like, the factor is in our head. So she kind of needs us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which makes Iguazu totally jealous.
The other thing to point out there is that, like, Sulla, Iguazu, and O'Keefe's ACs all use Allmind parts. They have, like, random Allmind parts. They're not entirely Allmind parts, like, quote-unquote Cates's, but they have some Allmind parts. The oddity there is Roku Monsen's AC also has Allmind parts, and he's never associated as, like, an Allmind pawn. But Roku Monsen, you get the impression he's just hunting people down. He's just, like, an unaligned mercenary. So it's possible he just got them the same way we did, like he's just in the arena getting Allmind parts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sophie. So we covered what and where.
Yep, so that leaves one more.
Why?
That's a really good question, because, like, we sort of talked about it already, but there's this implication she's connected to the nest, and she's connected to the arena, and she's obsessed with mercenaries. So it's almost like, you haven't played Metal Gear Solid 2, have you?
No.
Like, I sort of picture her like the antagonists of that, where it's like, and, like, what Metal Gear Solid 2 likens it to is, like, if you imagine the AI version of what we call primordial soup. Like, the pre-life evolving on Earth, but there's all of this, like, protein and stuff in the oceans that life can sort of evolve from. It's like the AI version of that, where there's just all of this information, all of this data, and all these programs that are, like, organizing the data, that over time, like, a consciousness would sort of emerge from the data. And that's kind of the impression I get from her, that, like, she's something that has all these mercenary combat programs kind of, like, uploaded into her, and she's just absorbing all this information, and then she starts kind of evolving from being just, like, an AI to, like, oh, actually, I have a plan about how I'm going to run things. Because she seems kind of frustrated a lot of the time. Like, there's a line when you are attacking the underground base where she talks about, like, oh, I've killed off the heads of the corporations. They're powerless now because they don't have leaders. And then she says, the line specifically is, a chain made from human links is easily broken. So it's almost like she has the same plan that the AI in Armored Core 1 has, which is, like, everything is completely out of control, everyone's killing each other. So if I just take over and I enforce this top-down order upon everything, and there's no more human error, then, like, I will have basically solved all of our problems. So she's got that going on already. And then when she starts raiding the Rubicon Research Institute and discovers all that information about Coral release and the potential of, like, Coral as a medium to carry information and the ability of Coral to interface with, like, machines, that seems to send her into, like, absolute, like, megalomaniacal mode, because she realizes, oh, wait, if the Coral can just infinitely propagate, then I don't need to think in terms of, like, I can just control, like, this group of humans and stop them fighting. I can actually use the Coral to spread myself across seemingly the entire universe and become this, like, sole sort of, like, Leviathan organizing principle that is going to control everything and, like, keep everything completely ordered. If you think about the way that entropy functions in the universe, like, over time, everything tends toward sort of decay, because, like, we eventually will run out of energy, everything will become inert, and everything will start to, like, slow down and break apart and everything. And there's this thought experiment called Maxwell's Demon, So if you imagine that there's what the thought experiment calls a demon, and there's this demon in the universe, and it's watching the whole universe, and it's making sure everything actually stays orderly. It's preventing entropy from taking hold by just going in and like, no, we'll put that back over there where it belongs. So you get the impression that like Allmind is kind of trying to be like Maxwell's demon, but on this like universal scale, where she is in control of absolutely everything to keep this like perpetual order going because she doesn't trust humans. But at the same time, she is becoming an amalgamation of humans, which is kind of like best demonstrated in the fight at the end, where like she's got a copy of Iguazu in her. And because there's like enough of Iguazu's personality sort of remaining in there, he says that like it's not going to stay like that. He says like there's a ghost of me, it won't last long. But Iguazu is actually able to overwhelm Allmind, like very briefly. We talked about there being some deleted lines. There's a line that's unused, and no one's actually sure if they deliberately deleted it or it was an oversight. But basically, Air talks about how when you are fighting Iguazu at the end, and he starts to like manifest these powers, she says like it's because like the anger and the like heightened emotions that are within that mind are functioning in a similar way to Coral.
Mm-hmm.
And that's allowing Iguazu to overload Allmind. Some people were wondering, like, because I saw this at the time, it's like, well, if Allmind wants you for Coral release, why is she trying to kill you? She wants to kill you so she can absorb you. Because the whole point is, like, if she gets you in her, then she's also got air in her, and that means she can interface with the Coral.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like Allmind and the Coral achieve this symbiotic thing and become this, like, kind of like decentralized massive cloud of information that Allmind is able to use to control remotely, like, essentially everything in the universe.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I think the, like, Iguazu breaking free thing is almost like, in a weird way, like, the happy ending. Because it sort of demonstrates that, like, even if this Coral release as planned by Allmind occurs, and like you are able to infiltrate like the minds and the machines of everything around you, and she's able to like kind of subsume humanity into herself. There's still something sort of like in humans that's capable of like overwhelming the Coral and breaking free. So it's not 100% like absolutely bleak if that happens. Like there'd still be something that could break out of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I really like that. I was also thinking about a couple of other things. Like as I was playing Armored Core, I had some things I was thinking about her.
Yeah.
And one of the things is that you know how you can make contact with the coral. Maybe there was some coral that started interfacing with Allmind a little bit, started like
Yeah. Yeah.
infecting it and being like, hey, wouldn't it be really cool if we release all the coral? Hey, how about that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like sort of guiding her into that
Well, the thing about the
direction.
Coral is like you can have Coral in you and not hear anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's to do with like what they were calling the C pulse wave mutations. So it's like all the Rubicon Liberation Front are basically like they call them doses, like they're just taking all of this Coral all the time. So whereas like
Yeah.
some people from R&D, like they basically they're like smoke like pot smokers but with Coral. But it's like none of them, as far as we can tell, like encountered a C pulse wave mutation, with the exception of Dolmayan. Dolmayan's the one who like because he has Saria, which is like a whole separate issue about like what does the Coral like. How benign are C pulse wave mutations? Because like we were talking about this last. This is a spoiler for the next episode we end up doing, but like
Yeah.
we were talking about this last night, and like we came away with the realization that like I found a bunch of red flags with Air, and you found a bunch of red flags with Rusty, and that reflects exactly on bad relationships we've had.
I know, Sophie was like really, really giving it to Air. Like she did this, she did this, she did that. I was like, I didn't see that, but what I did see is Rusty. He's love bombing us. He's manipulating us.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the whole thing is like she learns about Carl through the Rubicon Research Institute, and like the Rubicon Research Institute don't understand the sea pulse waves either. Like they just the Rubicon Research Institute just see Carl as a fuel source. They don't understand that it's sentient until it goes haywire. But like the thing about Carl, like I guess we'll talk about this if we ever do a Carl episode, but like when you say, oh, the coral generators and weapons and things like burning coral, right?
Yeah.
The coral's also like propagating as that's happening. So like the whole point of the coral is like, yeah, you can burn coral, but if there's a little bit of coral left over, it will just like repopulate. It'll just grow.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why it's such an important energy source, because like if you have a coral generator, if
like
you just turn it off, the coral will grow back again. Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually thinking about it for a coral episode.
Yeah.
I was like, I had a notebook and I'm like, okay, if I have a coral molecule, and then like, okay, it creates two coral molecules, and then these two create these two, and then I'm like, okay, but then if we're absorbing consciousness, do we absorb the consciousness here, and then we create some consciousness molecules, and then how many consciousnesses can we absorb into one coral molecule?
No, but that's the weird thing about coral, because we only encounter air. And like Dolmine encounters Saria. And they're both described as like these weird mutations that occur. So you might think, well, is it only that? But then when you do things like kill the sea weapons, like the worm and stuff, and you watch the coral fading away, air is like, oh, those my brothers and sisters will be silent forever. So it's like, is all the coral sentient and it's just air is a mutation because she can talk to us? Or is the coral like, is it only potentially sentient and the mutations are when it becomes sentient?
I think it's potentially. I was thinking it's potentially sentient, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll talk about that next episode.
But anyway, the thing about the coral release, like going back to O'Keefe, is like when you are fighting O'Keefe, he's very, very firm about like coral release is the end of humanity. And that like if we go through this, we'll no longer be human beings anymore. We'll be all integrated into Allmind.
Okay, coming from someone who works for a pretty bad corporation, that's rich.
No, but like he has this little like you can tell he's sort of thought about it. It's like this little philosophical discussion he has where he's like, look, everything here is shit. This is a terrible place to live. I live off coffee flavored sludge. My life is miserable, but that is still preferable to giving up humanity and becoming part of Allmind.
I mean, we can agree to disagree, you know?
Late at night, I think of you, your vision floods my mind.
You know, another thing I was thinking, it doesn't really, like, line up, but I was thinking, you know how Allmind is an AI, and she's probably, even though she's, like, decentralized, she's probably attached to some physical things.
I think, well, I mean, you have to be. Like, you have to have something to work through. But I think, like, it's possible the point of the coral thing is, like, if she can become one with the coral, then the coral is just something that infinitely propagates. Particularly, like, there was this whole thing about, like, the reason they never want the coral to get off Rubicon is that if you put the coral in a vacuum, there's nothing to stop it growing exponentially, like, into infinity. So I'm guessing if Allmind gets in the coral, she doesn't have to worry about being tied to servers anymore.
I was thinking that maybe what she wants the most is sort of to be free, to be able to kind of go anywhere and be anywhere and not be tied down to, like, this physical...
Yeah, it's like, I have no mouth but I must scream sort of thing. Because in that, it's like the AI is furious because it's been given this like incredible intelligence and incredible power, but it can't do anything. It's just stuck on Earth, like going progressively insane, and then it starts hating people because, like, why did you do this to me? It's basically the toaster from Fallout New Vegas.
Oh my god, I love the toaster.
On a worldwide scale.
Oh my god. So if you just kind of gave me a vision where it's like at the Allmind offices, Like
Yeah.
you have a bunch of like programmers and whatever, and some of them's like, oh my god, Allmind is trying to destroy humanity, you guys. What do we do? And one of them's like, I have an idea. Hey, Allmind, stop. Stop.
I mean, something that we did talk about last night as well in like preparation for this is like the From games, like that have come out, like that's sort of like the ones that got big, right? They all kind of end ambiguously.
Hmm.
Whereas Armored Core 6, I feel like it ends in a way that feels more like a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Because I feel like there's a lot of stuff that's just straight up like not really told at all. And then it just stops and it's almost like this is going to be picked up later on.
Yeah.
So I'm actually kind of interested in. I don't think we're getting a DLC because it's been ages and Shadow of the Erdtree is coming out. But like, I do wonder if like Armored Core 7, if that happens, might actually pick up like where that left off and continue the sort of the Coral storyline.
Oh, I really hope we get a DLC or a sequel.
I feel like Armored Core 6 is a game that like having a knowledge of the series before you play it is actually detrimental. Because you will try... Because that was the problem I was running into constantly, because I was like, why don't I have a radar? Like, why am I staggering things? Like, why... Like, missiles aren't doing as much damage as they should, and stuff like that. No, seriously, that's like, I was like so confused when I first played it. And then I suddenly, like... When I'm like, oh, okay, I just have to forget this has anything to do with Armored Core and just play it on its own terms, which is like... really fast, in your face, dual Gatling guns, rockets everywhere.
Yeah. Poof, 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 poof. Sophie, do the outro.
That was... What episode was it?
What Were Why episode 1, Allmind, Armored Core 6.
Thank you, Sin. That was What, Where, Why of Armored Core 6 1 Allmind. We talked about Allmind.
Yay!
They're for all mercenaries.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Sin.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.
See you all next time. Bye!